When we first look at the female reproductive system, here is the view of the parts that we would consider. So we've got the uterus, the vagina, the cervix, the ovaries, the uterine tubes, and the external genitalia. So we'll go through these section by section. We're just going to do an overview today, but there will be a nice run through down here of the female reproductive system. So here is a picture of the female reproductives in their place. So you can see the urinary bladder here with the uterus posterior to that, vagina inferior to that, and then the rectum posterior to that. You can see the ovaries here. Ovaries are connected, well, almost connected with these little fibers here called fimbriae. And then from there you have the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. This is where ectopic pregnancies would take place. So if the egg doesn't quite make its way down into the uterus itself and it gets fertilized and stays up into the uterine tube, then that's an ectopic pregnancy. So there's a couple different layers to this. They'll walk you through that. There's some smooth muscle here that's run by different hormones, which is causing the contraction to expel the fetus, oxytocin. So oxytocin is one of the few things that is a positive feedback. So stretch receptors produce oxytocin, that causes contraction. Again, positive feedback loop here, and that's what causes childbirth. And then I can't think of too many other examples actually of positive feedback, but this is one of the main ones within the body. So you want to go through here and take a look at the ovaries. This will have some histology to them. Let's see if we get a good picture. There's the ovary, and so what you've got there is different layers to the ovary, and within the ovary there's eggs, and on the outside we've got primary eggs all the way moving towards the medulla, which you've probably heard that word in the kidney. So they start at the outside and they're small, and as they work towards the medulla they become larger, and then we end up with the largest of them, or the most prepared, the most mature is typically the one that we would ovulate. And again, that's a 28-day cycle. And so this is a pretty good picture of the mature one. We call it the Graafian follicle, Graafian, I believe. So the Graafian follicle is just the term we use for the largest follicle. And this follicle, you can see right there in the middle, the primary oocyte. That oocyte is the egg that will be ovulated at the appropriate time. If you look down below this, you can see that there are some smaller oocytes there, some smaller different follicles, and so they've got just one layer of cells around the outside and then the oocyte in the middle, and as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you can see that those granulosa cells stack one upon another, and then you get just one layer around the oocyte itself in the middle, and then a whole bunch around the outside of that. So here's another one. You can see those granulosa cells. You can see that they're calling this a secondary oocyte. The Graafian follicle is going to rupture, and then that will ovulate. Now, if we were to go back to the beginning, the ovulation, they should cover this, but we'll talk about it just real briefly. If we go back to the beginning, during ovulation, we've got the uterus here, we've got the ovaries, and we've got the fimbriae. And so here's the fimbriae, here's the ovary. They actually do not touch. There is a gap there. And so when that egg is released, it's released from the ovary, which is highlighted right now, and it actually floats through the abdominal pelvic cavity briefly while it goes into the fimbriae. So you can see there's the uterine tube right there. So then the sperm would hopefully unite, and then the egg and the sperm, the fertilization would occur and hopefully hang out there in the uterus and not be all the way down in, or not be all the way up in the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. So there's your ovary histology. Very, very important for all of this. Oogenesis, that's going to go, that video, it's fantastic. We'll talk about how those eggs or how those follicle cells mature and all that fun stuff. Otherwise, a little bit of history of the uterus itself. We've got two different layers on the inside of this, and let's see, I don't remember if they have a video on this. They might, but I'll talk about it just real quick. Basically, on the inside of the uterus, you have two different layers of what we call endometrium or endometrial tissue. One is a functional layer and one is a basal layer. So that's probably what this paragraph's telling us here. The basal layer, that never goes away. That's always there. And then that basal layer has these things that we call spiral arteries. And these spiral arteries dilate or constrict based on the hormone cycle. And so as you go through the cycle, you begin menses, and that is when those spiral arteries have been constricted to the point where all of that functional layer, the stratum functionalis, then sloughs off, and that becomes the menses. Again, that stratum basale is going to stay put. Then we look at the outside of that, and you can see the myometrium. There's two different layers of that, and you also have the perimetrium. So perimetrium is analogous to the serous membrane that would lie in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Here's some endometrial glands, blood vessels, and some stratum functionalis, and it's saying deteriorating. Basically what that means is that those spiral arteries have begun to constrict and the menses is about to begin. This one shows not quite in a linear fashion, but out towards the endometrial gland, the stratum basale, you'll see the endometrial glands out in there. As you get towards the inside, so the top of this picture, that would be the lumen of the uterus. And so that's where egg and sperm would hopefully unite and fertilization would occur with implantation. That functionalis, that stratum functionalis or functional layer, that is the part that will slough off during menses. And this is a pretty good picture. And you can see the endometrial glands, the spiral arteries, they've actually got one tagged here for you. And the myometrium, which is that smooth muscle, again, that responds to the oxytocin in that positive feedback loop. Not much that they won't cover here with the vagina, the cervix. So that's generally the thing we're going to check for cancer. So they'll go in and do a pap smear, and they're going to swab the inside of that. It's just a common spot for cancer, so that's why we screen with that area there. The external genitalia, surprisingly, this is something that a lot of folks get wrong. Male genitalia people get right, but there's a lot of parts. Even in grad school, we had folks that couldn't quite get this figured out. So make sure you go through here and learn the bits and pieces here and get them labeled appropriately so that you can do well on the quizzes. And then here's the female reproductive system. So we have two different phases to this. One is the follicular phase, one is the luteal phase, and that is of the ovarian cycle. So I should say there's two different phases, but there's also two different cycles. The ovarian cycle is just that. So the developing follicle, you can see on the far left, you've got this little tiny one, the primary, and we're moving towards secondary, tertiary, and into the Graafian follicle, which you see right at ovulation is being expelled. That would be going from the ovary to the fimbriae through that little tiny gap in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Then you've got these weird looking, almost look like flowers or something like that after that. So we're looking at about day 18, 19 there. And that is the corpus luteum. And what that is that's the remnant of the follicle. And that will then leave behind hormones itself. And it becomes the corpus luteum, and then it turns into the corpus, I just lost what it's called, but it'll come to me. Corpus, I can't remember now. Look it up. So you'll have those two things, and it basically turns white, or it starts out as white, and then it turns to black. And that's the word I can't think of, is the Latin word that they use for black. It's corpus luteum, which means white, and then it turns to corpus black, whatever that is in Latin, and it still hasn't come to me. So that just goes on and on and on until you hit day 1 again, where that primary follicle is developing, and then we turn into the Graafian follicle. Again, just one egg per cycle, and that is per uterus. So sometimes it's the right ovary, sometimes it's the left ovary. Sometimes it can be the left ovary for 6 months straight. Sometimes it can be the right ovary for 2 months straight, or vice versa, any combination thereof. So some folks will have painful menses or painful cramping and stuff like that, and then they won't. And that oftentimes is because of one ovary having issues and the other one not. So if they are ovulating off of the ovary with symptoms, then they'll have a bad month, and if they're off of the ovary with no symptoms, then they'll have a good month. So then we go down below that and we look at the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle, this is mostly your hormonal driven, your functional and your basal layer of that endometrial tissue. So with the sloughing off, you can see that happening on day 1. And then we have this proliferative phase, and they're showing you some estrogen and progesterone. So those are going to spike at different times. And the progesterone is up right now. And we're talking about day 5, day 6. Progesterone is up. That is causing the proliferative phase of this endometrial tissue to grow. Inside of each of those little columns there, you can see those spiral arteries. So with those being present or dilated, that tissue can now get nutrients, and it will continue to thicken and thicken and thicken all the way up through the secretory phase. You can see ovulation occurring there. Ovulation occurring, we would hope that implantation of that fertilized egg would happen somewhere in that 15 to 28 day range there, right? You can see that the endometrial tissue is nice and thick and lush and ready to have that implantation occur. If that doesn't occur, then the hormone levels drop off, and we can see that endometrial tissue begins to slough off as those spiral arteries are constricted. If it does hang out, then the hormone levels are maintained, because that egg, that little, the implantation will cause progesterone to maintain over and over and over. And this is much the same way as how birth control works, is we just basically stay in that secretory phase, and we never get back to the menstrual and the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. That is about all I will go over. We've got a little bit on the mammary gland and lactation. So there are different lactation hormones that drive this. Those lactation hormones happen to be the same ones as the birth cycle. So you can see the oxytocin. So the oxytocin, it's one of the few hormones that comes from the posterior pituitary that stimulates milk release. Things that stimulate oxytocin are going to be suckling, or stimulation of the nipple, and believe it or not, a baby crying. So you can be a mother, and if you are a lactating mother and someone else's baby is crying, then that will actually stimulate the oxytocin to be released by the posterior pituitary, and then you will have what we call letdown, and then you have, milk that is being let down into the mammary glands and ready to be discharged. We won't get much into the sexual reproduction and development, but there is a beautiful picture of the sperm and the egg. So this is the story where this is one of the few stories where the fastest person doesn't win. So more or less the story of this is that the first sperm to get to the egg is not likely going to be the one to get its genetic material to unite and fertilize that egg. There's an acrosome at the tip of that sperm, and that is an enzyme that's going to help break down the outside, that corona radiata that you can see on the egg there. That enzyme is going to help break that down. But the first sperm there generally starts to break it down. Second one does a little more work, and so on and so forth. And so in other words, the sperm that gets there at the right time is generally the one that will get its genetic material and get that fertilization to take place. And then we become an embryo, and then we become a fetus from there. Beautiful video on the fertilization to implantation, path of the zygote, and 2 weeks after conception. That's going to show you, what different things are starting to develop. The developing embryo, this is really, really cool. It blows my mind that an organism as complex and magnificent as we are comes from two small cells. You've got the sperm and the egg, and then those unite and we form, the embryo, and that embryo then goes on to form 3 different tissues, and then those 3 different tissues go on to form every single organ system within the body. that placenta there. You can see the placenta. So the placenta is actually its own separate organ. So believe it or not, women grow an additional organ just to support and sustain that embryo as it develops into a fetus. Just taking a peek here, see if there's anything else we want to talk about. And I think we will leave it at that. So looking at the syllabus, we are actually 1 week ahead. I mistyped the syllabus and I did not realize that they gave us a Thursday off for the Easter holiday. So this Thursday, the 9th, is actually a mini spring break for the Easter holiday. With that in mind, that gives us an additional week to take the final. And so because of that, I don't know if many people will be traveling for the Easter holiday. We will stick with the date that is on the syllabus, unless anyone has any objections. But I think it would be nice to get one class over a couple of weeks early. That way any unknowns that are out there with your other classes can still be handled and your studying can be sufficient. If nobody has any objections, that will be great. If you do, let me know. I don't think many are going to be traveling, so maybe that's just my thinking, and if I'm wrong, let me know. So we'll move ahead with the final being next Thursday, and we will go for that. My intention is to do a Zoom meeting, and I would like to do that Zoom meeting tomorrow during class time with another one to follow. So I'd like to do one tomorrow. It'd have to be, I'll have to check my schedule. I guess it wouldn't be class time for everybody, so let me take that back. Let's shoot for Saturday. Let's do a Zoom meeting on Saturday. I'll send out all that information in an email, but it'll probably be sometime early in the morning, 9 or 10 a.m. And we'll chat for a little bit, see if there's any questions out there, and we'll go from there. Have a great Easter.